my friends and my family. Thank you for joining me on my series, Asylum Sundays. I'm your host, Elle. It is the weekend before Halloween, and I really wanted to dress up as something, and then I got my t-shirt in the mail that I had ordered, so I was inspired to dress up as Pandora, but she's a lot prettier than me, so I had to get some work done. And unfortunately, my doctor isn't as good as the artist. He's just not as good of an artist because, well, the artist is Jeff Salgado and the doctor is me. So big shout out to him for this t-shirt. This is like one of my favorite pieces of art. I'll post a picture so you can see it better. I was just over the moon about getting this t-shirt and getting this on a t-shirt, and I was just totally inspired to be blonde. It's not for me, but that's okay. So you all voted on Instagram between patient files and serial killers for the last 2 weekends of October, and you guys totally picked serial killers. I listened, so for the next 2 Sundays, it's going to be killer files. Today's case is about the infamous Amy Archer-Gilligan, a pioneer in elder care and serial killer. As with most cases in the 18 and early 1900s, it's very difficult to find the correct birth date. Oh, so go. Go. As with most cases in the 18 and early 1900s, it was really difficult to find the proper dates and records. One of the records I was able to find was an 1870 census, which said that Amy was 2 years old. So I was able to find a birth year for her because different records have different accounts of her birthday. Amy Archer-Gilligan was born Amy E. Duggan in October of 1868. She was born in Milton, Connecticut to 2 Irish immigrants, James and Mary Duggan. She was the 8th of about 10, maybe 11 children. And honestly, who knows, because Irish are baby-making machines. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Grandma. Mental illness seemed to run in the family. Amy's older brother, John, was actually committed to the Connecticut Hospital for Insane, which I was able to verify on the 1910, 1920, and 1930 census. It was said that he was committed in 1902, so he was there for a really long time. He died in 1937, so it might be safe to say he passed away in the asylum, like many people did at that time. Her sister, or one of them, was also said to have been committed in 1930, but before that she was said to have become paralyzed after jumping off of the roof. So maybe that's where Amy gets her, knack to help people in need. In the 1900 census, she had lied about her birth year, which is probably why there are so many misconceptions surrounding Amy's birthday and age. But due to that 1870 census, it said she was 2 years old and she couldn't have lied on that. So we're just gonna assume that that's the correct date of birth. Also in 1910 census, so 10 years after the 1900 census, she had only aged herself 1 year. So in a span of 10 years, she said she had only aged 1 year. So in 1900, she said she was 26. And then in 1910, she said she was 27. But she would have probably roughly been about 42. So she's really not getting off to a good start here. Amy gave the impression that she had trained as a nurse at the infamous Bellevue Hospital in New York City. That's the one in the Nellie Bly video that she goes to directly after seeing Judge Duffy. You remember? You remember. You saw it. However, no records were said to have been found. Amy fell in love and married James Archer in 1897, and roughly a year later they had their daughter, but I think it was actually the same year and that they lied. Their daughter's name was Mary Julia Archer. Having a daughter, the newlyweds aspired to have careers where they could make enough money to support themselves, but also give them the flexibility for Amy to raise little Mary. And in 1901, Mr. and Mrs. Archer and little baby Archer, they were actually rewarded with the opportunity for that. The Archers were offered to move into a large home with John Seymour. He was a widowed elderly man who needed some care. After a few years, John had passed away as expected, and his family gained the estate. I'm sure this was a very stressful time for the Archers since they had grown to love staying in the home with and without John. And luckily, John's family agreed to let them rent the property. With having such a larger home than necessary for their family, they decided to capitalize on their good fortune, and they opened the first elderly home so they could help care for people in need. They created their business plan, and then they named their new business Sister Amy's Nursing Home for the Elderly. They ran their elderly home for a few years with pretty decent success, but But unfortunately, the family of John, the man who had originally lived there, they decided they wanted to sell it. They were just kind of done with the property. They wanted to wash their hands of it. I'm sure the Archers were pretty upset and like stressed out about this news, since that home was literally like their business, their home, their livelihood. And I'm not really sure if they had patients at the time or residents, but moving a bunch of elderly people would have been really challenging. The Archer family really had to act fast, and luckily they did have some savings. So they were able to find a home large enough for them in Windsor, Connecticut. There they opened the new facility called the Archer Home for Elderly People and Chronic Invalids. They advertised their business in the papers and also made these like little postcards with their information on it, so word got out pretty quickly. During this time, it was not common for elderly people to like leave the home. They were always kind of just, you'd like pass down the responsibility of the elders. So when this opened by the Archers, it seemed to be a great option for families that just couldn't care for their elderly parents and family anymore, whether that be due to like working out of town or just being like too busy raising their own kids or what have you. Amy and her family just really pioneered one of the first homes for the elderly in the United States, which I think is just really incredible, and actually like kind of admired that when I read it. With the need for this type of facility and it being so revolutionary, the Archers really didn't have any problems filling beds and ultimately filling their pockets. The elderly boarders could pay either like a weekly fee that ranged about $7 to $25 a week, depending on the type of care they needed, or they could pay $1,000 and that would cover them for their rest of their entire life. $1,000 at that time would be a little over $28,000 today. So you can see how this would be like a super lucrative operation to have and why they would want to keep running it. Amy had worked really hard to establish her family's name into the local community. She spent a lot of time and money to support her community, as well as her church, which was St. Gabriel. She even donated a stained glass window to her church, and she was seen as like a saint-like woman, helping everybody out, donating a shit ton of money. We just love it. This made her home more appealing because you have like a church-going family with a young daughter opening their home to take care of your elderly family, and she's a pillar of the community. This would just be really appealing for people to put their family there. Amy even recruited a minister of a local church to come and conduct service for people who were too frail to leave the home and go to church. I assume it was a minister and not a priest because not everyone was Catholic back then. It was still kind of frowned upon. However, the home would not be known as a house of the Lord for long. And in 1909, there was a lawsuit launched against the Archers by the McClintock family regarding the neglect and care of one of the elderly boarders. Unfortunately, this was settled out of court for $5,000, and so there was no formal investigation. $5,000 back then would be approximately $150,000 now, which is not enough to just let something like that go, in my opinion, but times were tough. Shortly after that, another boarder of the house complained of his living conditions, but he didn't have a support system like the one prior where they took her to court, and so Amy just signed him into a mental institution. She was not having any more complaints at her home. 3 years later, which is so weird, it seems like everything happens in threes with her. In 1910, James, Amy's husband, passed away. Mary, their daughter, was around 13 years old when he passed. I'm sure that was really hard for her, but it was said that she was very musically inclined, so she kind of had that outlet. She was actually enrolled in the Windsor Campbell School for Girls, and they had piano lessons there, but the tuition was quite steep. It was about $410 annually for school, and then $50 more a year for piano lessons at the school. So that would be around $1,400 annually, which is a lot. Like, that's a whole car. So Amy really needed to keep her finances together, especially after losing her husband. And about a year after James died, Amy was hit hard with some back taxes. She wrote the taxman, "I asked to be dealt with honestly. That is all. I fully realize my great loss and sorrow, and that I am alone dependent upon myself to care and educate my little daughter, who was deprived of her dear father, whom she loved dearly. But I am not afraid to demand justice, and I think it is about time it is shown me." She was pretty pissed off because in Windsor, the taxes had really spiked due to the population of the area almost doubling in a year. She was not okay with them asking her for more money because of a boom when she had been there the whole time. So money was getting a little tight, but she really was just doing everything she could to make sure Mary had a proper education. During these days, it wasn't uncommon for women to be re-wed if they were moderately good looking. And it was even expected that a woman have a husband around. So obviously she remarried because she was like wicked hot. Like seriously, she was like really, really hot. 3 years after James's death in 1913, Amy married Michael Gilligan. Michael Gilligan had been married previously. He had several children with his wife, who was Maria, but she had passed many years earlier. I'm not sure if any of the kids were in the house with Amy, but I think his youngest daughter was about 18 when they got married. And 3 months later, Michael Gilligan was dead. Michael's children and family were all very suspicious of his death because it had only been a couple months and his entire life insurance policy was made out to Amy. Michael was not thought to be sick at all. His family said he was very healthy. His cause of death was valvular heart disease and acute bilious attack, which they actually called indigestion. I don't know why so many doctors use indigestion diagnosis as a cause of death in the Victorian era, but it was a total cop-out. I really read about it all the time in history. It's just weird. After her second husband's death, Amy, of course, carried on business as usual. The boarders of the Archer home for elderly people and chronic invalids. Such a long name. The boarders were obviously elderly and disabled. Many of the family members would just sort of like drop them off. They would like pay and then like drop them off and then they would just go about their lives because they're really busy. A lot of people worked out of town and had kids, like I said. So they would just pay their dues and they wouldn't visit too often. Some of them would just ditch them completely. But one of the boarders, his name was Franklin Andrews. He was in his 60s and he was an able-bodied man. He would even help with some of the housework. And one day he was either painting the fence or gardening. It's reported both ways. But either way, he's like doing some work around the yard, right? When he suddenly collapsed. 2 days later, he died and his cause of death was listed as a gastric ulcer. Franklin, though, was very close to his family and he would write often. And in these letters, he would mention how many deaths were happening at that home. It really concerned him. And when he died, his sister came out to like gather his belongings because she's in charge of his estate, and she found some letters from Amy. These letters were pressuring Franklin for more money. That was another thing that Amy would do, is she would try to pressure people into giving them estate when they passed away, putting her on their life insurance policy, ask for more money each month, say, you know, things are more expensive, taxes are more expensive, can you like tip me, can you give me more money? Anyway, so she found these letters to him, which he had declined to give her any more money and declined to give her the estate. His sister was pissed. So she went to the state attorney, but they were totally ignoring her claims. So she decided to take it up with the media. The media outlet that she reached out to was the Hartford Courant. She reached out to the man who wrote the obituaries. His name was Carlin Gosley. Carlin Gosley had already been disturbed for years with the amount of deaths that he would cover in the obituary section that came from this specific elderly home, the Archer home for the elderly people and chronic invalids. I'm just gonna keep saying it because that name is so ridiculously long. It's kind of hilarious. How did they even fit that on a postcard? Anyway, after Franklin's sister reaching out to Carlin, he decided to investigate the local pharmacies and see what kind of purchases were done by Amy for her elderly home. He discovered that Amy had purchased arsenic multiple times in large quantities and that she had purchased 10 ounces of arsenic, which I read has the potential to kill several hundred people, but I also read it has the potential to kill 100, so I don't know. But this was on the pharmacy register, and it was listed as purchased due to the fact that she had rats and bed bugs. Carlin took this information to his editor, whose name was Clifford, and they launched a full-on investigation. They started with researching the death certificates from another elderly home called Jefferson Street Home for the Elderly. Comparing the number to Amy's elderly home, the findings were actually really shocking. The numbers were almost identical. So the Jefferson Street and Amy's house had the same amount of deaths. However, the Jefferson Street home housed 6 to 7 times as many boarders as Amy's house. She's killing them, you guys. Amy's home had 60 deaths in 10 years. 48 of those died in a 5-year span between 1911 and 1916. That's a lot of people. The paper printed multiple articles calling Amy's home for the elderly the murder factory. Eventually, these articles stirred up enough ruckus to catch the eyes of the police, who obviously should have been looking into this as soon as it was complained about by Franklin's sister, but they didn't. And so after this ruckus, they finally launched an official investigation. Good for them. Fucking great fucking job. During the investigation, Franklin, Amy's late husband Michael, and a few other boarders' bodies were exhumed. Franklin was said to have enough arsenic in his stomach to kill 6 healthy men. Amy was originally arrested and tried for the murder of 5 people. However, her lawyer was surprisingly really good, and she was reduced to 1 count of murder, which was the murder of her resident Franklin Andrews. Like, thank God for his sister. She really advocated for him. She really stepped up to the plate. I mean, who knows how many more people would have died if this had gone on. She was awesome. She's the kind of sister I want to be. And I'm sorry I don't know her name, but I could not find it. Basically, the timeline is super muddy when it comes to these victims and when they died, so I'm going to be a little bit vague, and I'm sorry, but there aren't many names for the victims that I could find, and I'll just be sharing what little I know to kind of give a little insight on the victims and try to pay a little bit of respect for them and what happened to them. So one of the victims' names was Charlie Smith. He was said to have been the oldest or the most aged victim, but I'm not sure how old he was. Charlie had retired from a brass company that worked for parts on things like steam engines and like the valves for them. Brass valves. You know, because this was like the age of steam engines. He was found with arsenic in his system. However, the jury was a little skeptical because brass was also found to have arsenic in it to help with like corrosion and stuff. And he worked in the brass polishing room, so she was not sentenced for his death. After Franklin passed away, his room opened up and Amy had reached out to a husband and wife who needed a place to stay. Alice was the wife and she was 69 years old, and I couldn't find much on her husband. But anyhow, they shared Franklin's room, all married and in love and just happy to have a place to stay instead of like being a burden to their family. You guys aren't a burden. We love you. You can stay with me. Unfortunately, Alice got very violently ill shortly after moving in. Alice wanted her private doctor to be sent, and the doctor did come, and eventually they diagnosed her with having cholera. By the time the doctor left, Alice seemed to be doing much better, so her doctor had no further concerns because Alice was thought to have just healed up quick and made a full recovery. She was generally a healthy woman, but unfortunately, I feel like I keep saying unfortunately, but all of this is so unfortunate. A few days later, Amy called Alice's doctor and said that Alice had taken a turn for the worst, and so the doctor came out, and once again she was very violently ill. The doctor sees that she's just in a horrible condition. She's in a ton of pain and she's just really on her last leg here, so the doctor gave her some morphine, gave her goodbyes to Alice, and Alice passed away that same night. Amy was not convicted of her murder, and they did not find arsenic in her system, allegedly. Amy's second husband, Michael, was found to have arsenic in his brain, and Amy's youngest alleged victim was Maud Lynch, a 33-year-old woman with epilepsy. Maud's husband had left her with her parents because he just couldn't really take care of her and work at the same time. I guess she had really bad seizures and things like that. You know, epilepsy is really hard to manage without medication. Unfortunately, her parents also had a hard time taking care of their daughter. They all kind of just decided it's in Maud's best interest if she stays at Amy's house. She was said to have died from strychnine poisoning. Amy was not convicted for her death, as it was unknown if it was a suicide, since it was a different poison that was utilized this time. Testing for arsenic in bodies wasn't anything new. They had actually been doing it for around 90 years, so it was very common practice, and they were really good at it at this point. Unfortunately, the lawyer that Amy had argued that some of the bodies were thought to be embalmed with fluid that contained arsenic, which was very common, but at this time it was actually illegal in Connecticut, and using arsenic embalming fluid was actually outlawed in 1908, so quite some years before that. They were all supposed to be using formaldehyde, and no formaldehyde was found in Franklin's body. But Amy was arrested in 1916 and charged with Franklin's death. Amy was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang, but she pled insanity. Amy's daughter Mary testified that her mother was addicted to morphine and was not in her right mind during all of this. I feel so bad of her. Like, she lost her dad, she lost her mom, she lost her stepdad. What happened to her? Mary, are you okay? She pled for her mother not to be executed, of course, and Amy was deemed criminally insane after an appeal a few years later after being held in a prison, and she was then taken to Connecticut General Hospital for the Insane in Middleton. So basically, she had a family reunion. At this time, we have to remember there was no state agency, like there were no ombudsman or anything like that. But fortunately, Connecticut decided to pass a bill called Old Folks Homes, which required these facilities to have licenses and for the state to have inspections to prevent this sort of abuse. So that's actually a really good thing that came out of it, though like 60 plus people had died. We really don't know how many. And since we are on the topic of elder abuse and wrongful death and things like that, I do want you guys to please sign the petition, which will be linked right in the description box. My good friend's grandmother allegedly was mistreated, malnourished, and dehydrated, and due to this she had kidney failure and passed away in a nursing home in Florida. So if you could please just sign the petition. They're not asking for money, they're just asking for your name, and if you could just please sign that way they can have this investigated. This is very important. We really need to be sure that we're protecting the elderly because they just really don't have many people out there looking into this stuff, and we can't have the same things that happened in asylum continue to happen to the elderly. Thank you all for joining me on my second episode of Asylum Sundays. Please give it a thumbs up if you like it. Subscribe, notifications on, all notifications, boop doop doop. There's a whole process now, YouTube. What are you doing? Anyway, and share it with your grandma. Maybe not this episode, but you know what I mean. Thank you. And if you don't, I appreciate you anyways, and I'll see you next Sunday. Bye. I am an artist. Will you call your grandson? I don't know, walking around being a weirdo. Well, where else would you call him? Today we are going to be doing ASMR because it's Halloween and I'm scared. Listen how loud my smile is. This is why I don't smile. No. They can't know I'm not blonde. I'll never be accepted into Hollywood. Sorry, I'm not really good at FX makeup or wigs. By the way, girls who wear wigs, like, y'all are amazing. This was a challenge for me. Boopity boo. Why am I dressed like this? Well, first of all, I hate myself. Blah, blah, blah. Nobody cares. I always got in trouble at sleepovers because I would do this. And everyone knew I was still awake.